There are 7 quiet ways people measure how far they can push you. Most of the time, you never realize the test just happened. Think about the subtle signals that suddenly make an interaction feel different. Situations where something in the interaction quietly shifts. Someone cuts you off while you're speaking. Someone casually asks for something that was never really your responsibility. Someone questions your opinion just enough to see how firmly you stand behind it. Someone stretches a boundary to see if it moves. To most people, these situations feel harmless, just normal social interactions. But they are not random. They are psychological probes. Niccolo Machiavelli understood something disturbing about human nature. People are constantly reading each other, quietly evaluating confidence, boundaries, and emotional control. Because the moment someone senses weakness, the dynamic changes. Respect becomes optional, and people start speaking over you. They begin pushing you further than they ever did before. Most people never notice when it begins. They only see the result. They wonder why they are suddenly treated differently, why their opinions carry less weight, and why certain people feel comfortable disrespecting them. But the truth is simple. At some point, without realizing it, they exposed a signal of weakness. And once that signal appears, the social hierarchy quietly recalibrates. The joke, the interruption, the request that crosses your boundaries. Moments most people ignore, but moments that quietly decide how people will treat you from that point forward. And the people who understand this dynamic don't wait until respect disappears. They recognize the signal early and change the dynamic before it changes them. The difficult part is that these signals rarely look like tests. They appear as ordinary social moments, a conversation, a joke, a small request, nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. But if you watch carefully, a pattern begins to emerge, because people are constantly looking for signals that tell them how far they can push you. The first test is simple, and most people fail it without even noticing. One of the first ways people secretly check if you're weak is by testing a small boundary. It rarely looks like a confrontation. Most of the time it appears as a simple request that seems reasonable on the surface. Someone asks you to do a little more than what was originally agreed. Maybe a colleague expects you to take on something that technically isn't your responsibility. Maybe a friend assumes you will handle something for them, or someone casually asks for your time as if it naturally belongs to them. At first it doesn't feel serious. The request sounds small, even harmless. And because it sounds harmless, most people agree without thinking too much about it. But what people are actually watching in that moment is not the request itself. They are watching your response. They are paying attention to whether you question the request or whether you quietly adjust your boundaries to make things easier for them. Most people choose the easier option. They say yes, not because they truly want to, but because saying no feels uncomfortable. They don't want to create tension, they don't want to seem difficult, and they assume the situation is too small to matter. But psychologically, that moment matters a lot, because the moment someone learns that you will quietly stretch your boundaries, a signal is sent. And once that signal appears, the pattern begins to repeat itself. More requests appear. More expectations slowly form. Responsibilities that were never really yours start becoming part of your routine. You begin giving more time, more effort, and more energy than was ever originally expected. Not because people are always malicious, but because human behavior follows a simple rule. People repeat what works. If pushing your boundary worked once, it will likely work again. Over time, something subtle begins to happen. The boundary that once protected your time, your effort, and your value slowly starts disappearing. And by the time most people finally recognize what happened, the dynamic has already changed. And that is exactly how the first signal of weakness is created. But boundaries are only one way people measure you, because the next test is even more subtle. And most people never realize when it happens. Another way people secretly check if you're weak is through silence. It rarely looks like a challenge. Most of the time it appears as an uncomfortable pause in a conversation. You say something in a meeting, you share an opinion, Or you make a suggestion during a discussion, and instead of responding, the other person simply stays quiet. No agreement, no disagreement, just silence. At first it feels strange. The room suddenly becomes uncomfortable, and because that silence feels awkward, most people immediately try to fill it. They start explaining their point again. They begin adding more details. Sometimes they even start softening their own opinion, not because they were wrong, but because silence made them doubt themselves. But what people are actually watching in that moment is not your opinion. They are watching how you react to the silence. Do you stay calm and let the moment pass? Or do you rush to justify yourself? Most people rush. They talk more. They explain more. They try to convince the other person that their point was valid, and without realizing it, they slowly give away control of the conversation. Because the moment someone learns that silence makes you uncomfortable, a signal is sent. They realize they don't need to challenge you directly. They can simply stay quiet and let you weaken your own position. Over time, something subtle begins to happen. You start over-explaining. You start defending points that never needed defending. And the more you do it, the more the balance of the conversation shifts. Not because the other person argued better, but because silence made you lose your composure. Another way people quietly check if you're weak is through small favors. It rarely looks manipulative at the beginning. Most of the time it appears as a harmless request, something small that seems easy to do. Someone asks you to handle a quick task for them. Someone asks you to take care of something they could have done themselves. At first, it feels normal. Helping people is part of everyday life. And because it feels normal, most people agree without thinking too much about it. They assume it is just a one-time favor. But what people are actually watching in that moment is not the favor itself. They are watching how easily you adjust your time and effort for them. Do you pause and question the request? Or do you immediately say yes? Most people say yes, not because they truly want to help, but because refusing a small favor feels uncomfortable. It feels easier to agree than to create tension. And that is where the test quietly begins. Because the moment someone learns that you will easily adjust for them, a signal is sent. The favor worked once, which means it will likely work again. Soon another request appears, then another one. Small favors slowly turn into expectations. Responsibilities that were never really yours start becoming normal. Over time, something subtle begins to happen. People begin assuming that your time is always available. They stop asking if you are busy. They stop checking if you are comfortable with the request, because in their mind, the answer is already clear. You will probably say yes. And the more this pattern repeats itself, the more your time quietly becomes something others feel entitled to use. Not because they consciously decided to take advantage of you, but because your past responses taught them that the request would work. Eventually, something interesting happens. The favor stops feeling like a favor. It becomes something people simply expect from you. And once that expectation forms, saying no suddenly feels harder than it should. Because now people are no longer asking for help. They are assuming your cooperation. And when a person repeatedly accepts these small expectations, the dynamic slowly shifts. Your time becomes easier to take. Your effort becomes easier to demand. Not because your value disappeared, but because people learned that your boundaries could quietly expand whenever they needed them to. And this is where most people finally realize what the test was really about. The favor itself was never the real point. The real point was to see how easily you would adjust your time and effort. It was to see how far your boundaries could quietly stretch. Which means the next time a small favor appears, the situation deserves a little more attention. Not every request needs an automatic yes. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is pause for a moment. Sometimes it means asking yourself one simple question. Is this really my responsibility? Or am I quietly accepting something that was never mine to carry? Because the moment you start recognizing the test, the dynamic begins to change. People quickly learn that your time and effort are not something they can casually assume. Another way people quietly check if you're weak is by challenging your opinion. It usually doesn't look like an argument at the beginning. Most of the time, it appears as a casual disagreement. Someone simply questions what you just said. You share an idea during a conversation, maybe during a discussion with friends, maybe in a meeting, or even in a normal everyday debate. And someone immediately pushes back. They question your point or suggest that your view might not be correct. At first, it feels normal. Conversations naturally involve different opinions, but what people are actually watching in that moment is not your idea. They are watching how firmly you stand behind it. Do you calmly explain your point again? Or do you immediately begin to step back from what you said? Most people start adjusting their opinion very quickly. They soften their words without even realizing it. They begin saying things like, "Maybe I'm wrong," or "I might be overthinking it." The confidence behind their original idea slowly disappears, not because the idea was weak, but because they want to avoid tension in the conversation, and that small adjustment sends a signal. It tells people that your position can easily move under pressure. Once that signal appears, something subtle begins to change. Your opinions start carrying less weight in future conversations. People interrupt your ideas more often. They challenge your thoughts more casually, because they have already learned something important. They have learned that a little pressure makes you step back. Over time, the pattern slowly repeats itself. Your ideas are questioned more frequently than others, and eventually something interesting begins to happen. People stop taking your perspective as something firm. They start treating it as something flexible, something that will probably adjust if they push a little harder. But the moment you recognize the test, the dynamic starts shifting. Disagreement stops feeling like a threat. It simply becomes part of a normal conversation. And once people realize that your opinion does not collapse under small challenges, they begin approaching your words very differently. Because when someone sees that your opinion quickly adjusts under pressure, they learn something important about you. They learn that a small challenge is enough to make you step back, and once people learn that, the conversation dynamic quietly changes. Your ideas start facing more resistance than others, not necessarily because your ideas are worse, but because people already believe they can move your position. So the next time someone casually challenges your opinion, the moment deserves a little more attention. Not every disagreement is a problem that needs to be softened. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay calm and repeat your point clearly. Sometimes it simply means standing behind what you already said. Because the goal is not to win every argument. The goal is to show that your position does not collapse under small pressure. And once people recognize that your ideas remain steady, even when questioned, the tone of the conversation begins to change. Challenges become more respectful. Disagreements become more thoughtful. Because the moment people realize your opinion is not easily moved, they stop treating it like something that can be casually pushed around. A fifth way people secretly check if you're weak is by observing how you treat your time. It rarely looks like a test in the moment. Most of the time it appears as a small interruption. Someone assumes you will adjust your schedule for them. Maybe someone shows up late without apologizing. Maybe someone suddenly asks for your time as if it was already available. At first it doesn't seem serious. Everyone gets busy and plans change sometimes. But what people are actually watching in that moment is not the situation itself. They are watching how easily you adjust your time. Do you protect your schedule calmly, or do you immediately rearrange things to make it easier for them? Most people adjust without thinking. They tell themselves it is not worth making a big deal. But that small adjustment sends a signal. It tells people your time is flexible, and once that signal appears, the pattern begins to repeat itself. Delays become more common. People arrive later than expected. Requests appear at the last minute. Over time, something subtle begins to happen. Your time slowly becomes something others feel comfortable using. Plans start shifting around other people's priorities. Your schedule slowly becomes something others feel free to rearrange. not because people consciously decide to disrespect you, but because your past reactions taught them that the request would work. Human behavior follows a simple pattern. When something works once, people assume it will work again, so the interruptions continue, the delays continue, and eventually something interesting begins to happen. People stop asking if you are available. They begin assuming that you probably are. That assumption slowly changes the dynamic. Your time stops feeling like something valuable. It begins feeling like something flexible, something that can easily move whenever someone else needs it to. And that is why recognizing the test matters. Because the moment you start protecting your time calmly, the dynamic begins to change. People begin approaching you differently. They become more careful about how they ask for your time. Because once people realize your schedule will not automatically adjust for them, the test quietly stops working. A sixth way people secretly check if you're weak is by watching your reaction. It usually begins with something small that slightly provokes you. Maybe someone makes a sarcastic remark. Maybe someone throws a subtle insult disguised as a joke. At first it doesn't look serious. It feels like normal teasing in a conversation. But what people are actually watching in that moment is not the joke. They are watching your emotional response. Do you stay calm and composed? Or do you react immediately? Most people react without thinking. They start defending themselves. Their tone changes. Their voice becomes sharper. Sometimes they start explaining too much. Sometimes they show visible frustration. And that reaction sends a signal. It shows that your emotions can easily be triggered. Once people notice that pattern, something subtle begins to happen. The teasing becomes more frequent. The comments become slightly sharper. The provocations become a little more intentional. Not always because people want conflict, but because they already learned something about you. They learned that a small push creates a visible reaction. Over time, the dynamic slowly shifts. Conversations start revolving around your reactions. People begin expecting a response from you. They assume that if they push a little harder, you will react again. And once that expectation forms, something important changes. The person who reacts first slowly loses control of the interaction, because the moment someone controls your reaction, they begin controlling the direction of the conversation. That is why recognizing the test matters. Because the moment you stop reacting automatically, the pattern begins to break. When people see that their provocations no longer produce the reaction they expected, the test quietly loses its power. The final way people secretly check if you're weak is by observing your consistency. Not what you say once, but whether your behavior stays the same over time. At the beginning, most people appear confident. They set boundaries, they speak clearly, and they show a strong position. But what others quietly watch is whether that strength lasts, or whether it slowly fades when pressure appears. Maybe someone challenges you more than once. Maybe someone repeats the same request again after some time. They are not always testing the situation. They are testing your consistency. Because a single strong response does not mean much. What really matters is whether that response stays the same every time. Many people start strong. They say no once. But when the situation repeats itself, they slowly soften their position. They adjust a little more each time. And that is where the real signal appears. Not in the first reaction, but in the pattern that follows. Because people pay attention to patterns. If your boundaries change every time someone pushes, people learn that patience will eventually break them. They learn that if they repeat the request often enough, your position will slowly move. Over time, the dynamic becomes predictable. Your first response sounds firm, but people expect it to change later. And once that expectation forms, your words begin losing their weight. That is why the final lesson is not about reacting once. It is about staying consistent. If you decide something is not acceptable, that decision must remain the same tomorrow, next week, and next month. Because the moment people see that your position does not slowly move over time, the tests begin to disappear. Not because people suddenly change, but because they realize the outcome will always be the same. And once that realization appears, something interesting happens. People stop testing your limits as often. They begin observing you differently, because when someone realizes that your boundaries do not shift, that your reactions remain calm, and that your position stays steady over time, the entire dynamic changes. The quiet tests slowly stop appearing, and what replaces them is something very different: respect. And once you begin noticing these patterns, something interesting starts to happen. The small moments that once felt confusing begin to make much more sense. You start recognizing the silence in conversations. You begin noticing when someone pushes a small boundary. You start seeing when a favor quietly turns into an expectation. And you notice when someone is simply watching your reaction. Because most of these tests were never loud. They were quiet observations that happened in ordinary situations. Small moments where people simply watched how you responded. They watched whether your position stayed steady or slowly moved. They watched whether pressure changed your behavior. And those observations slowly shaped how they treated you later. That is why understanding these patterns matters. Because the moment you recognize the test, your response becomes more intentional. You stop reacting automatically. You stop adjusting yourself just to avoid tension in the moment. Instead, you begin responding with awareness. Your boundaries remain clear and your reactions remain calm. And when that consistency becomes visible, something interesting begins to happen. The dynamic between you and other people slowly changes. People become more careful about how they approach you. They become more thoughtful about what they ask, because the signals they were once looking for are no longer there. The patterns they expected from you no longer appear. And when that realization finally settles in, something very different begins replacing those quiet tests. Something far more powerful begins to take their place: respect. If you found this video useful, consider subscribing to the channel, because these videos are meant to help you understand the hidden dynamics behind everyday interactions. And before you go, I want to ask you something. Which of these tests have you personally noticed the most in your own life? Was it the boundary test, the silence test, or the favor test? Let me know in the comments below.